everyone, and welcome to the History Hotline. I am your host, Deanna Lyncook, and we have a special guest in the building. Another guest. I feel like you're definitely being spoiled this month because guests on guests on guests, but I'm especially excited for this one. I say this about all my guests, but this guest, I've been waiting. I think before this podcast was even a thing, I wanted her as a guest on this podcast that didn't yet exist. So that is how much this has been preempted. So I just need you to feel the excitement that I am feeling right now. I have one of my best friends in the world here. So maybe I'm biased, but maybe she's just fantastic. Vanessa Stewart. Welcome to the History Hotline. Now, Vanessa is not a historian. But she is in some ways, because as we know, the field of history and the discipline of history really does jump and span into different disciplines. You know, it's not just, you don't just study history and history, whatever subject you're looking at, you know, everything has a past and everything has a history. And when we look at, you know, the theme of migration as we're doing this month, we have to remember that migration is a theme that kind of falls into different disciplines. And one of those disciplines is politics, geography, you know, international relations. And so we kind of have an expert in those kind of fields of scholarship today in Vanessa. So I'm going to tell you a bit about her, and then we'll get into some questions about your research and find out why Vanessa is on the podcast today. So Vanessa, she did her bachelor's at Queen Mary University of London in International Relations, graduated in 2018, went straight into her master's in Global Development Futures in 2019 with a dissertation titled Conceptualizing a Hidden Population, Narratives of Seychelles Migrants in the UK. And Vanessa's research across, I think, her undergraduate degree and her master's degree looked at the theme of migration in different global contexts, looking at Africa, looking obviously at the Seychelles, and looking at, you know, different migrations across the world, and also development in different countries and different settings. And so I think this is the reason why Vanessa is a perfect guest for today, but especially because we are looking at the theme of migration and the way that community kind of is formed, and the way that different groups have found themselves navigating British society, which is kind of what we look at on this podcast with the Windrush generation and with Black people. But how about the people that aren't necessarily classified in society as white or British, may not fall into the category of being Black, but how do they fit in? And so we have Vanessa here to talk about people from the Seychelles.
What an introduction. Thank you. I'm kind of speechless. I think we should just wrap it up here and just leave it at that.
Your research has been, honestly, the amount of people I've spoken to about your research that do similar things but never the same have said, and you know, with your research you will know this, is this work is not being done. You are filling a gap that we don't know enough about. And I think it was really important that I had you on this podcast, because as I said, it's all well and good we think about the Windrush and Caribbean people and African people, but well, say people from Seychelles are classified as African, but what are they? So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to break down today. I have in my mind a small history of the Seychelles. However, before we get into that, we're going to find out more about Vanessa. So, Vanessa, if you don't mind, I have some quick-fire questions for you. Let's talk about maybe why you love history, since we're here on a history podcast.
Yeah, it's only right, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I just think history is juicy. You know, it is really, really juicy. It's a good bit of tea. We love a bit of tea. So, you know, it is that really. But what it does is that it allows us to understand a lot more, to process what has happened, to empathize with that, but ultimately also to advance from that and move on from those things as well. But, you know, process those learnings as well.
Definitely. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And if you had to pick one, what would your favorite historical time period be?
I suppose because of your history. And I guess my personal experiences, well, really my parents' personal experiences and my grandparents, because I'm a 90s baby, but it would be post-World War II Britain. I think that is a key significant time for Black people in the UK more
Yeah,
broadly.
definitely.
So I definitely do have a lot of interest in
I
that
like
era.
that. Yeah, perfect. And then, do you have a favorite historical figure?
You know, the first person that jumped out to me was Frank Spannon. And I think that's because of I didn't really study him in great depth at uni, but we definitely did cover some of the text. And that was the first thing that popped out to me, actually. I thought
Yeah,
his,
definitely.
yeah, I think the work is just revolutionary, really.
Yeah. And he writes, I think he writes like kind of no one else. Or
Yes,
it was the
exactly.
first thing I read that was sounded like that, where I felt
Yeah,
kind of like seen in a way.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
I completely
yeah,
agree with that.
definitely.
Completely agree.
And then we kind of have spoken about your research interests, but how is it that you came to decide to study the Seychelles? That's a bit of a leading question. I just want you to talk about your
Yeah.
life. But yeah, why did you pick the Seychelles? Did it follow on from your undergraduate research, or was it a complete departure?
It was a complete departure. I think at undergraduate level, and I'm sure you and plenty of people listening in, they'll appreciate that undergrad, you are still quite limited
Yeah,
in your kind of creative freedom as a researcher and as a writer. And I think really, it's you're not limited completely, obviously, but when you get to kind of postgraduate levels, you have a bit more freedom and a bit more ownership over where you want to take your research. So for me, I just kind of wholly embraced that. And I was very conscious of the fact that the Seychelles migrants in the UK have been under researched. I say
yeah,
have because I've now done a little bit of research, but still under researched. And I wanted to fill this gap a little bit. And obviously, you've mentioned it already, but it's important to acknowledge that this piece of work is incredibly personal to me and as a researcher. And it's important to note my positionality within this work. So I'm of dual heritage. My mother is from Seychelles. My father is from Jamaica. Using this research, I chose to conduct semi structured interviews, and that created a space for really personal accounts to emerge because the conversations flowed really well. So I won't go into all of that because that's all to do with my methodology, but it was a lot of detail, a lot of ground was covered. I had 22,500 words, but I definitely would have liked double or
wow,
triple that because so much was covered, and as you said already, the thing that really struck me from the beginning was the lack of research in this area. Um, I mean, non existent. Now, forgive me, obviously, times have changed. I conducted this research a few years ago, but at the time, there was literally nothing on Seychelles migrants in the UK, absolutely nothing. And we both know that there's endless amounts of research in about migration discourse more broadly, massive integration, assimilation, personal reports, accounts, etc. The list is endless, but none of this or none of what I had access to covered Seychelles migrants explicitly or in great detail.
yeah,
So by that I mean there were basic statistics on Seychelles arrivals to the UK,
okay,
and the Seychelles was referenced on our embarkation cards and stuff like that. But that was literally it. So you can imagine, for me personally, the realization of that was absolutely huge. And I remember, sitting with my supervisor, sitting down, and we're looking at each other like, okay,
Mhm.
this might be the first of its kind.
Wow,
And that has massive implications, because I couldn't draw direct comparisons, so to speak. And whereas the Windrush generation, for example, which you've researched a lot, Deanna, there are multiple accounts and experiences, but I didn't have that. So in my literature review, I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that I'm trying to, well, I did situate the narratives of Seychelles migrants within the broader discourse
mm,
and just trying to introduce that. But
yeah,
it was, I suppose, a bit of a daunting realization for me, but
yeah,
daunting is probably not the right word. I'd say because I thoroughly enjoyed my MA dissertation,
yeah,
the whole experience really. But knowing that there wasn't anything else out there like that definitely added some weight,
yeah,
some
of
serious
course.
weight to what I was doing. So a huge sense of responsibility, an overwhelming sense of pride, but ultimately I was working to put my people in the discourse.
Exactly. Wow. And I think that is so important because that's why, you know, these disciplines need the kind of diversity of thought, because
Mm,
you know it had to be you to write that in the way you wrote
mm,
that, based off of who you knew, potentially who you had access to, who felt comfortable sharing their stories with you. And not everybody could have written that research, and definitely not in the way that you wrote it. And so I think, as you said, you know, you have to place yourself within this research as the researcher. But also, I think it's important that we understand that researchers, historians, geographers, you know, political scientists, whoever is doing this research, has a position.
yeah.
I think we should go into, you know, the country of the Seychelles. I can't lie to you, Vanessa, you are the first person I've ever met from the Seychelles.
Whoop, whoop.
And I'd heard of the island, and I knew it was an island. And I can't
Mm.
lie to you, I don't think I really knew where.
Several islands, several islands.
So, wow. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. The learning begins. Yeah. So I knew that it was in my head, right? I wasn't sure if it was around Africa or
Mm,
around like Asia slash Australia. In my mind, I didn't. I just knew it was like over there. If that
mm,
made sense. It wasn't. I
yeah.
knew it wasn't near the Caribbean. I just knew it was the other side, probably equatory, a bit below. But yeah, that's all I knew, and I think maybe listeners might feel the same way. So I did some little Googles, found out
Hmm.
that it's in the Indian Ocean on
Hmm.
the eastern edge of the Somali Sea. So like just kind of east of East Africa.
Yeah.
So islands over there. Population under 100,000, around
Hmm.
98,000. So quite small, but then for an islands quite big. But then I guess spread out over islands,
Yeah.
still quite small. Is it kind of like everybody knows each other vibes?
Definitely that.
Yeah.
Definitely those kind of vibes. Yeah.
Okay. So if this reaches the Seychellois community, you know, everybody will know who I'm.
Basically, yeah,
Wow.
basically. Everybody knows each other by their family name, and
Okay.
last name usually,
Yeah,
yeah,
that
and
makes sense.
areas and stuff.
So historically, with in terms of like people and migrations, I've got that it was kind of uninhabited prior to the Europeans in the 16th century, and then we have the French and the British colonizing, but kind of ends up in the hands of the British. And then independence happens in 1976, and then the story kind of goes from there.
I think that was a solid
Yeah,
summary. Yeah.
I think so. That was my, you know, my contribution to this podcast episode. The rest is up to you.
No pressure.
um,
Yes, and that it's it's difficult to really kind of conceptualize because
yeah,
you're imagining a place that, like you said, has no native population. People are brought over there, but yet there is that kind of colonial history. There is a history of rulers,
yeah.
and influence, and that has had lasting impacts on the generations after that.
Wow.
And then questions of culture come into this as well, how cultures were formulated, beliefs and values,
Yeah.
massive influences from Europe, really. And those still resonate today. I mean, even the
Wow.
capital, Seychelles, is Victoria.
Wow.
And there's a small little Big Ben in the middle of the capital by the roundabout. Yeah. And so these things are lasting legacies, right?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I think the debate around um, kind of the culture in Seychelles and the Creole people
Yeah.
is very interesting because we're all very mixed. And I think the idea is that we are just kind of an amalgamation of different peoples,
Yeah.
different cultures and beliefs
Wow.
all mixed together. And that is, I think, partly well, heavily linked to the fact that there wasn't a native population there beforehand.
Wow. That's so interesting. It's like they colonized a land, but not necessarily a people.
Yes,
Wow.
yes, yeah,
And interesting also because it's not a country sorry, it is a country, of course. It's not a country like within Africa, so it's not part of that landmass of Africa and the continent. It is a series of islands.
yeah. And I think that that reflects the diversity that is seen in Seychelles today. The fact
Yeah.
that it is kind of off the main landmass of Africa as a continent.
Yeah.
It's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Like you said, you wasn't sure whether it was part of Asia, was it part of Africa?
Yeah.
And this is a very common kind of misunderstanding in a way. But it also is testament to the fact that it evidences really that there have been multiple influences that have come through, whether that is from parts of Asia, South Asia, parts of Africa. And now you have this kind of mixture of peoples, which exists now in the Seychelles.
Fantastic, that is. The stereotypes, but of, you know, the African nations, it has the highest GDP, I believe.
Hmm.
And also it's like one of the two African countries classed as like high income.
Yes.
So of all the countries would be classed as developing, if that term's used. I know that's quite a problematic term in some ways. How kind of, I guess, does Seychelles then not match up to Africa, but is it because it's an island and it is geographically separated, and now in some
Mm.
ways, I guess you could say financially separated,
Mm.
because it doesn't fit necessarily those tropes? Is Seychelles positioning any different? Like, is that maybe the reason why we don't think about it in the same way we think about the solid African continent as a block?
That's interesting. A very interesting question. I would say yes, there are definitely some differences, but I think that's also largely, yeah, like you said, it's due to the geopolitical position of the Seychelles, and I think the strategic interests as well, the connections they have with the Middle East and parts of Asia, and also what they rely on as well as a country.
Yeah,
So they are heavily reliant on travel
yeah.
and the fishing industry. So fishing, we export a lot of our produce out of the Seychelles.
Okay.
And obviously, with regards to tourism, we rely on a lot of travelers to come in.
Mm,
Seychelles is a very kind of idyllic
of
destination,
course. Oh,
hotspot for honeymooners and the regular holiday goers, you know.
yeah.
So they rely heavily on that, and obviously that has been impacted more recently, sorry,
Yeah.
with COVID, as with many other countries. But looking at its position with Africa, that is very interesting, and perhaps I need to give that some more thought. But I do think it is different in some respects, but the size of Seychelles must also be considered too. It is a very small nation, with under 100,000 people there.
Yeah.
So that has to be factored in when you look at kind of debates around development or the
Mm,
pace of development, if we're going to phrase it in that way. They haven't got surrounding countries around them, so they don't face certain challenges that other countries in Africa do, whereas the Seychelles is literally in the middle of the ocean. So, in that sense, the world is their oyster. They can trade quite easily and ship goods outwards. So, I think there's key differences
yeah.
to be aware of.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. I feel like already we could just end it there. I've learned so much. Just kidding. So, thinking about your research then, and thinking
Yes.
about people now, let's move slightly away from the island as just an island, and let's put some people there, and let's put a community, kind of a face to the community, shall we say. And
Sure.
your research was titled, so conceptualizing a hidden population. I'm assuming the hidden is referring to the fact that they are under researched, within British scholarship especially, and you know, this narrative of migration from people from the Seychelles to Britain had not really been recorded, and thus was hidden. And you're exploring the narratives, of these people,
Yeah.
and having read your research, which is absolutely fantastic, and maybe as a listener you'll be able to read it too one day. But thinking about the fact that you broke your research down into looking at the different kind of generations.
Yeah. So for some people, they don't like using those kind of rigid binaries of first generation, second generation. But for me, just for research purposes, and it was a kind of ease really to group my participants, sorry, in that way. So when I reference the first generation migrants in my research, I'm referring to the parents and also the young children that came over at the time. So
Yeah,
broadly just the first people that came over, and the second generation migrants, I'm looking at the offspring of those people ultimately.
yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I think in America actually they have a term called like the 1.5 generation or the one and a half, and that refers to like say children that came over from that
Mm,
said country, at a young age but were educated through the American system. So they're kind of first generation, but they're not
yeah,
because they grew up and were educated in the country that they've moved to.
this is it. Oh,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah,
Yeah, I know.
that,
I don't know how I ended up finding that out, but but quite an interesting kind of point to raise, how schooling, I guess, can impact your socialization into a country. And points to pick out from your research was this
Mhm.
idea about this lack of identifiable community.
Mhm.
Because, you know, when we think about the Windrush generation, say, this is the first big wave of black people. So they're
Yeah.
very identifiable. You know who they are. They, according to the British, smelt funny, talked funny, were loud,
Mm.
whatever they had to say about them, but they were an identifiable community. You know, within the Seychelles, there's not, when I think of the Seychelles, I don't think of a person looking a certain way.
Yeah.
I don't even think of a particular shade of skin color necessarily,
Mm.
because, as we've said, it was an uninhabited island, and then you have the French and the British, and then you have the fact that it is an island in the Indian Ocean, next to Africa. So, yeah, kind of talk us through this idea of it being an unidentifiable community, or lack of identifiable features,
Sure.
maybe.
So, as you said, this was kind of a key finding of mine in my research. And ultimately, the research confirmed what I thought already,
Yeah,
really. And like I said, based on partly my own experiences in that sense, of not kind of being aware of a migrant community, so to speak. So, part of this and part of me theorizing this, I had to question how we define a community,
yeah,
and what are the staple features of a community. So this is an abbreviation, but Sheringham does a lot of work in this area. And this scholar argues, states that migrant community infrastructure is typically epitomized through the establishment of businesses, shops, community spaces, or places of worship that ultimately resemble a likeness to the given heritage country or countries. So I think that's a pretty good working definition to apply here. Um, and my research found that there was a lack of an identifiable community. And I made three assertions ultimately. So I'll just talk through all three of those because I think that'll be quite easy to kind of summarize it. The first reason that I state in my research is to do with the suspected scale of the Seychelles diaspora. And this has significant implications. So, in the absence of official statistics, we can only speculate that the diaspora will amount to a small fraction of the overall Seychelles population of 98,000. So, in my research, I reference the embarkation cards from 2011 and 2012. And these indicated that most of the immigration, from the Seychelles was directed to Europe. However, the country stated only provides an indication as the final destination country could change over the course of the journey. So, if we take 2011 as an example, then the embarkation cards indicate that 692 Seychelles persons were headed to the UK. So, contrast that with the wider population figures now. In 2011, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, found that 7.5 million of the resident population in England and Wales were born outside of the UK. So, if we apply that data from the embarkation cards,
yeah.
which I emphasize is merely an indication, then in 2011, only 692 of the 7.5 million non UK born population was Seychelles.
Wow. You guys are
So,
small.
yeah, yeah, real small. There's not many of us. So, with that in mind, unlike other migrant communities, for example, the Seychelles diaspora doesn't necessarily have the critical
Mm,
mass in order to reproduce a Seychelles cultural space.
absolutely.
The lack of people is significant, and also I wasn't able to pinpoint where these communities were
Yeah.
across the UK, but no doubt they're spread out,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
So that also is a factor because there's an element of distance between Seychelles peoples that are in the UK
Yeah.
already. And then the second kind of reason that I reference is the significance of placemaking. So within migration discourse, there's a lot of discussions around the concept of placemaking, especially when considering super diverse neighborhoods. So, within this diversity, how do you sift through the noise?
Mm,
How do communities put their stamp on certain places ultimately? And how do they assert themselves? What structures do they create, which they, are used to define them? How do they make these spaces their own? And one key observation here that I draw upon is from Pemberton and Phillimore. And they recognize that under such conditions, that is super diverse neighborhoods, no single ethnic group dominates, but rather people are unified by difference. So for me personally, I think that's exactly what happened with the Seychelles diaspora. I think they've found commonalities within the wider community. They have seen elements of themselves in others, whether that's to do with eating practices, religion, values, for example. And this has all contributed to the process in which I would argue that Seychelles migrants have demonstrated a degree of affinity, and they have ultimately blended into the super diverse landscape rather than asserting distinctiveness through the formulation of their own migrant community infrastructure. I think there's just been a kind of a general merging, so to speak, and they've kind of blended in. And that's why I chose the title A Hidden Population, because I don't think
Yeah.
they're easily identified in that sense.
Yeah. So it's kind of not a, sorry to cut you, a
Mm.
deliberate hiding by others. It's people coming from the Seychelles in terms of the small numbers, in terms of the kind of no real necessity to create spaces or, as you said, places of worship, shops, that kind of thing. That has just led to them being hidden through no fault of anyone deliberately, but it's just kind of incidental.
Yeah, I would say so. And
Yeah.
yeah, I would say so. And the last point that I make provides kind of a reason for that as well. And I think it's important to note that this lack of community
Yeah.
is linked to the efforts on behalf of the Seychelles government as well, and their
Oh.
efforts to encourage return immigration
Mm.
through scholarship programs. So that's to do with students that go abroad, for example, to complete a degree, and their scholarship is based on that, and they're expected to return home. So in 2011 and 2012, education was the second most popular reason for Seychelles staying
Yeah.
abroad. And I can't really imagine that that has changed much since
Yeah.
then. And one of my participants explained how she is bonded to the Seychelles government. Once completing her studies, she is expected to return home to work and contribute to the economy. This is so, so important. This is absolutely huge because it links to other arguments around the brain drain, which is a really, yeah, I
Mm.
can see you like nodding away. Yeah, this is a
Of
really
course.
common concept. And the brain drain, for our listeners, is to do with individual talent and ultimately the immigration of highly trained or qualified people from a particular country to another. And usually that is referring to people leaving their heritage country to a more, well, I don't know why they're leaving. I can't say why they're leaving, but perhaps they think a different country is more progressive. I say in inverted commas,
Of
or
course.
whatever. So this idea of kind of losing their professionals and losing their really qualified people, this has been, explored massively within migration discourse and other discourse as well. So it's a very common or popular concept, shall I say. So the Seychelles government plays a distant yet
Yeah.
significant role in restricting the time spent abroad, which I think plays a significant role in preventing an identifiable migrant community from actually forming. So, this is really important to note, the kind of influence that they have from overseas and the expectation that students have to return and to support and to feed their nation and their economy and to contribute back home in that sense.
Definitely. And maybe that then, without me putting out some false truths, but maybe that then links to the kind of idea of Seychelles being
Mm,
having
mm.
this high GDP and being of a high income country in comparison to other African countries who do suffer from the brain drain. Same with Caribbean countries. So that's very interesting that I think Seychelles government have kind of, I guess, clocked it and said, well, no, we have to protect, our little island and our.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think attitudes around that are changing. And who knows,
Yeah.
it might not be the same case in 5, 10 years from now. But referring to the participant that I mentioned before, when I was speaking to her, it was there was kind of a bit of a resentment there. I'm bonded to the Seychelles government. It's a strong word, and that was the term that she
Term.
used, bonded. So it's kind of, then you have to kind of think, well, is this your choice? Is this somebody else's choice?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think there is kind of a generational shift occurring. It is really linked to where the students are as well. And I think Seychelles is a very small nation, as we've
Yeah.
established. But to come from Seychelles and then live in London is a huge contrast. To have that experience, I think, at university, especially at a time usually at uni when you're so excited just to be doing something different, to be meeting new people, that in a new environment is even more exciting, right? And probably even harder to turn away from. The amount of people that we know that came to London and didn't
Yeah,
want to go back home, and I'm talking like a 2-hour train
absolutely.
train away. That's just an example, of the kind of differences that we're referring to here, really. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes complete sense. And I think it, again, it does really link back to that title, and I guess
Yeah.
why it's so poignant. So thinking then about people from Seychelles in Britain, because I'm assuming not every single student goes back, or not every single person that comes over
Hmm.
is a student, and so might come later on in life, or as you said, as a child in
Hmm.
earlier days. um was there, you might not know the answer to this, and that's fine, but I guess I'm trying not to compare to the
Mm.
Windrush generation, but I guess it is my base of migration knowledge, just from my own research. Was there maybe a time where there was the biggest wave, or was there a particular, I don't know, event in the Seychelles that meant a lot of people were moving over to Britain, maybe independence, or was it just something that steadily happened over time? Because people
Mm.
move around all the time. There doesn't have to be a political movement or shift.
Yes, is the simple answer. What I found, and not just in this research, but okay, I know now drawing on wider conversations that I've had, the movement of people from the Seychelles occurred under colonial rule, under British rule. And that was
Okay.
because it was seen as you were moving within the British Crown colony. And this was dependent
Okay.
upon Seychelles men and women being part of the army. So this gave them the access to move. So a key journey, shall I say, that was documented in this study is the movement of one particular family from the Seychelles to Malaysia, which at the time was under British rule, to Cyprus, to another army base, and then to the UK. So this movement all occurred within the extensions of the colony, the extension, sorry, of the colony. But I would say that would probably be between the 60s and
Wow.
70s,
That
I would
makes sense.
say.
That's so interesting, because thinking about other groups, so South Asians, from the Punjab region, in a conversation I had earlier today, but I guess if you're listening on the podcast, you won't hear it till maybe next week or
Yeah,
the week after, um, in this migration series. But one of the reasons why that community came over, and the reason they felt that they could, was their
yeah,
contribution to World War II. Similarly, with the Windrush men, primarily that came on that first, well, not the first ship, but the first big ship, were ex-RAF
mm,
servicemen who came with the claim of, well, I worked here during the war, and now I have a kind of, not entitlement, of course, but
yeah,
I have a right to be in this mother country, to continue my training, my service, or whatever.
yeah,
And so, very
yeah. That's
interesting that
exactly it.
everything just connected. And that's one thing about migration, and why I wanted to look
Mm,
at it as kind of a series this month, is to draw out the similarities, because you can't look at any one group's
no,
migration to this country in isolation. They
yeah,
are all interlinked because of empire. And until we, I guess, understand the power and the widespreadness, if that is a word, of empire, it's quite difficult to then understand some of the things you've
yeah,
spoken about, in terms of like creating community and assimilation into British society, and kind of what happens next when said people from said place
exactly.
land or arrive in Britain. I want to talk to you about chapter 6
Mm.
of your dissertation. Everyone's probably thinking, well, what happened in chapter 6? Well, I'll tell you. The title, Am I a Part of Britain, or Is Britain a Part of Me?
This chapter, I think, is probably one of my favorite ones. It definitely kind of brings everything kind of together. But interestingly, and I've mentioned earlier on in the podcast, there is a dislocation between the older and younger members of the first generation migrants. And that is to do with what you said about the influence of Britain in the Seychelles. And what I look at, what I kind of define it as, is pre integration into British and European society ultimately. And I saw this happen. Well, the accounts really kind of evidence that something had happened before. The kind of the extent of the influence of the British colony and European influences was so strong in the Seychelles, especially for the older members of the first generation migrants. So what I mean by that, let me elaborate a little bit more, is that their lifestyle in Seychelles ultimately prepared them in some ways and eased this process of integration, and also instilled an unwavering sense of patriotism as well, which is still very evident to this day, might I add.
Wow.
So the older members of the first generation overwhelmingly reported positive experiences when they came to the UK. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that alone
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
in
Just
the
sorry, just
1960s,
thinking of that,
70s. Yeah,
right? In contrast to,
exactly.
yep,
Yeah,
everybody else.
basically everyone else. Exactly. And these experiences were rooted in long established British identification. It demonstrates the extent to which colonial powers penetrated African nations at the time. If we look at 1960, for example, at that time, only 41,700 people were in the Seychelles. That's a very
Wow.
small population, and potentially maybe made it easier to diffuse ideas. It was occupied by the French beforehand, as we said, but under British colony between 1903 to 1976. So, the people of Seychelles have been, are in a way conditioned to British European life. And for these participants in my study, this led to a lot of kind of self assurance and the expectation that they
Mm.
will integrate, because they just thought they were moving kind of from one British society to another. But importantly, this is linked to the experience of army living and army lifestyle, and the fact that these individuals, they weren't really exposed to wider society, so they kind of maintain this British colonial army bubble, so to speak. um, but importantly, and I'll explain in a second, this was only for the parents, because the children of the first generation, sorry, the children of that generation went to
Yeah.
school, which is what you said before, and
Right.
therefore they were exposed to other social settings. So back to the
Yeah.
parents now and the older members of the first generation, because they felt that they were moving from one British society to another, this kind of nostalgia for home, this longing for home, was not explicitly expressed. And that's not to suggest that it was entirely absent. I'm not suggesting that at all.
Yeah.
But this preconditioning to British life may have altered their expressions of nostalgia, because home in the Seychelles resembled a likeness to
Yeah.
home in the UK. So then
Mm.
we link that back to the creation of community, and there are huge questions over whether the pioneer migrants, so the first migrants to come over,
Yeah.
even felt the need to establish a community or not, because it was kind of the same,
Wow.
apart from the weather, of
Yeah.
course. But
Right.
it was like very similar for them. So there was a very evident dislocation between the parents and the children within the first generation. So now looking at the younger members, common theme for them,
Yeah.
which will resonate with many of the accounts of people at the time, is a lot of bullying. And this is obviously reflective of wider societal attitudes at the time towards racial differences. And therefore, I kind of explore how this impacted the way in which they embedded themselves within society and the way in which they negotiated this
Yeah.
embedding. and the forms it took in different domains and to different degrees. And one thing that really came out, they all mentioned sport, and sport as a coping mechanism and also an access point to other social
Yeah.
spaces. And it
Wow.
allowed them to develop social capital and friendships, etc. So that was a way in which they were able to, I suppose, formulate their identities in a way, a sense of belonging too. And I think that was part of their way in which they felt part of Britain, so to speak, because they were actively
Yeah, that
taking
makes
part
sense.
in activities that they do at school, and this is kind of a very common thing to
Yeah.
do. But then looking at the second generation migrants, so we're looking at the offspring now, who have gone through the British schooling system and have been raised here, British born, this is all they know really. The experiences were very different. The things that I really focused on, or what came out of the findings, shall I say, is what they brought up in the interviews, was more to do with their mixed heritage identities. So this was the kind of key factor in how they felt as part of Britain, and also how connected they felt to their heritage country, which is Seychelles. So
Yeah.
for this generation, the participants that were included in my study were of mixed heritage. So a handful of the participants, one parent was from Seychelles, one parent was from England, and then there were others that had a different
Yeah.
combination. But let me focus on the ones that were
Yeah.
of mixed heritage, Seychellois and English descent. They often mentioned that their mixed heritage was often overlooked by the onlooker. And this is partly, well, entirely really to do with their complexion, and their physical characteristics. And one participant explained something that happened at school, which was quite interesting to document and to know. And she explained that once her mixed
Yeah.
heritage was detected, the participant gained access to a particular social group that she'd previously been denied access to.
Mm.
She was incorporated into this group based on the criteria of sameness. But this was also ultimately dependent on this
Okay.
group exercising a degree of selectivity as well.
Yeah, of course.
Another interesting finding that came out was also the significance of the family name. So, this was especially interesting when considering the respondents that possessed a somewhat discrete migrant identity, which is what we were just talking about with regards to complexion and kind of being overlooked by the onlooker in that sense. And so, quite often their mixed heritage was undetected by others. So in this instance, quite often the marker of difference was actually the surname, having a more unconventional, un-English, non-British sounding name creates ideas around what someone of dual heritage with a non-conventional name should look like. But yeah, it was very interesting to see that kind of emerge in the study as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, thinking about the kind of racialization, shall we say, of different groups of people that move into this country, because it is and it was the case that, if you're not white British,
Mm,
you are othered. And so this othering in the 60s, 70s, so on, it kind of others everybody else as black, whether you are, from India, Pakistan, Seychelles, which is under
mm,
British rule in the 60s anyway. So essentially, British people coming over to Britain, but are othered
yeah.
by way of you weren't born here, or are othered by, as you said, surname, or othered by the fact that, complexion might be slightly darker than a standard average white British person, for whatever reason that might be. Um, and so I'm just kind of thinking now, I don't mean to be ignorant, but I just feel like I know what the listeners might be thinking at this point. If you have the Seychelles, which has no,
Mm,
population prior to the Europeans, and then you have French people and British people who
mm.
I'm assuming are all white, where does the racial difference come in? I feel like I
Yeah.
don't want to sound ignorant, but I kind of think people
No,
might be
no.
thinking this because I kind of am. And yeah, how does that all
So
fit, kind of thing?
the variation was introduced ultimately through slave trade in a way. So
Oh.
again, another thing that's not really highly documented, but what is documented is the fact that the settlers did take people from the eastern parts of Africa. So that's how you get the mixture, so to speak. So it was born
Oh
out of
my
that.
goodness.
So that's why it's still very important to acknowledge that there wasn't a native population, so to speak, but people were still taken
Yeah.
from Africa in the same kind of way, not on the same scale, obviously. And from what I
No.
understand, it wasn't on the same scale as far as I'm aware. And I don't think the
Yeah.
conditions were exactly the same. I think it was forced labor, indentured labor, slavery. They all kind
Mm.
of, there's definitely a bit of overlapping there. So that's how the kind of initial mix or mixture or difference was established. And then from then, I suppose, just more movement in that area and more people
Yeah,
settling.
absolutely. And so that might then alter your perception of self, knowing your ancestors
Yeah,
were enslaved peoples or of European descent, or a mixture, probably
yeah,
in most cases. The slave trade in the Seychelles wasn't well documented. I'm sure where people came from is pretty much
exactly,
unknown, or maybe even
exactly.
destroyed,
And
because
that,
we know how
yeah,
the
like
colonials
to
like to
erase
destroy
history, yeah.
documents.
And that's why
Mm.
I loosely said Eastern Africa, because that's all I know. I
Yeah,
can't pinpoint it. I mean, it might be somewhere, but
absolutely.
from my understanding, it's Eastern Africa. The transatlantic slave trade obviously looks at the other part. It looks at the western side of Africa and that movement across. But what about the other side? What about the movement to the other region?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the cogs are whirring in my mind. I feel like I've just been blown away on so many different levels. I love
Mm.
learning, as we know, and I'm passionate about educating other people. But when I get to learn, it's an amazing day. I didn't know so much of that, and I've read your dissertation, and I've still learnt more. So I'm honestly honoured, really, to have you here as our resident expert on the
Thank
Seychelles.
you. Not an expert. I
Wow.
mean, when you asked me to get involved in this, I was genuinely blown away, super honored, because I feel like I completed my masters and unfortunately I've kind
Yeah.
of put it to the side and I haven't really looked at it much since,
Yeah.
which is not great, obviously, and I wanted it to be
Well,
out
no,
there in
but
that way. So I'm,
yeah,
yeah, just
definitely.
so grateful to even just have the discussion and just to kind of, yeah, explain the findings.
I am honestly honoured to learn about all of these different waves of migration and different groups of people, and I think this angle from this island is just so perfect. And you were obviously the perfect person, and you have put your work out there. That is out there now in the world. That bibliography, those references. Whoever then needs to
Yeah,
pick up that baton to continue this
it's true.
research can do so. And I think that's with all research. Like, with any podcast episode, that might be the start point for
Mm,
someone's future dissertation at undergrad or postgrad or whatever level, or their own personal research. Who knows? There might be people now that are inspired to just learn more about the Seychelles. Before we close, maybe let's have a minute think about
mhm.
Seychelles today. Just give us a little bit about Seychelles today. I know that I want to go there, so if you'd like to sponsor my trip, anyone listening, PayPal account is in the link in my bio. But no, tell us about the Seychelles.
Well, obviously, I'm a bit biased, but it is truly, truly beautiful. A wonderful, wonderful place to be. I have lots of fond memories in the Seychelles, and hopefully, we'll continue to make many, many more. But yeah, definitely on the bucket list.
Absolutely.
For men, I think for a lot of people, it's on their bucket list to visit. So I highly recommend it. Yeah, the beaches are incredible. But I suppose there's been a kind of quite a significant change in the Seychelles recently. The end of last year,
Yeah.
they elected a new government. So this was
Wow.
the first transfer of power, sorry, for the first time since 1977. So the leader of the
Oh.
opposition party won, and this is the first opposition victory since independence from Britain. It's a signal of momentous change in the Seychelles, a huge milestone,
Yeah.
and they've kind of really demonstrated so far a commitment to reconciliation, to working for the nation, and embracing the younger
Yeah.
generation. Obviously, time will tell, and we'll soon see how this pans out. With regards to COVID recently, I suppose the Seychelles was hit quite hard because of tourism and
Yeah.
fishery, but their vaccination
Yeah.
rollout has been incredible. They were the first country in Africa to begin the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. They received donations from UAE and also donations from India, which is reflective of their
Okay.
close trade and cultural links with these countries. So strategic interests are at play
Yeah.
there. So yeah, they're opening back up, and I think for them it's very positive because, like I said, they rely heavily on tourism. So having travelers come back in, definitely a wonderful place to go. So if you get a chance, whoever's listening in your lifetime, do go and visit.
Yeah, well, you don't have to tell me twice. I'll be on the next available plane when those PayPal donations come in. But honestly, thank you so much, Vanessa, for being a part of this episode and part of this migration series. I don't know where this will be in the series as I am speaking to you, but I have a feeling it might start the series because I just think it's such a perfect place for us to start thinking about migration discourse. And it's just been explained so beautifully by you, so why not? So,
Thank you.
stay tuned, if you are listening. No worries. Stay tuned for the other episodes. Will be so just wanted to say thank you all for listening. Please follow on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn if you have it, and on the podcast platform that you like. Give us a follow, a like, and tell a friend about the History Hotline. So from me and Vanessa, thank you so
Thank you.
much and
Bye.
goodbye.